This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 534 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, I talked through the players that I'm targeting this year in drafts. Naturally, this week, it's all about players I'm avoiding. Now, I do want to say the word avoid is more attention-grabbing than anything else. I don't really avoid players no matter what. The names I'm going to talk about today, they're all good football players. They're all going to contribute in fantasy football. When I say avoid, I just mean avoid at cost. And I'll give that cost some context as much as possible on today's show. Every player is valuable at some point in a draft. It's just that in the majority of drafts this year, I'm not actively targeting these players. Now, before getting into the players that I'm avoiding, I wanted to let you know that FanDuel is offering an exclusive promotion for new sportsbook users. Join FanDuel Sportsbook today and make your first bet. If you lose, FanDuel will give you a refund of up to $1,000 in site credit within 72 hours. Your first bet after depositing will qualify. If you have multiple selections on one bet slip, it will be the first selection that you made. So head over to the FanDuel Sportsbook today and place your first bet. Must be 21 years or older and present in Colorado, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, or West Virginia. New users only. Max bonus $1,000 in site credit. See full terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-522-4700 in Colorado, 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa, 1-800-9-WITH in Indiana, 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan, 1-800-GAMBLER in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Virginia, Tennessee Redline 1-800-889-9789, or visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net in West Virginia. The first player I want to talk about to avoid this year, Aaron Rodgers. Now, I actually don't think that Aaron Rodgers' ADP on most best ball platforms is all that bad. He usually falls off draft boards at like QB8. I have him at QB9. It's just that there is one platform in particular, ESPN, where Aaron Rodgers is the QB5 in ADP. He's going ahead of Russell Wilson and Dak Prescott, and I cannot get behind that. More casual and home league drafters are going to be in on Aaron Rodgers because he's coming off this MVP season. He was a top 5 quarterback in points per game. He threw 48 touchdowns. He was a machine. But Rodgers also had a 9.1% touchdown rate last year. That's touchdowns divided by attempts. That was the second highest mark in NFL history. He had the most goal line touchdowns ever. The Packers scored 64 offensive touchdowns. That's been accomplished by just 2 teams since 2011. And if you've listened to this show this offseason, if you've listened to this show throughout the last few years, you know that those numbers regress. Rodgers' career touchdown rate is 6.3%. That's far lower than his 2020 rate. And before last season, when he had those 20 goal line touchdowns, his highest goal line touchdown total was 14. And teams who have hit 50 or more touchdowns in a season since 2011, they've seen that total on average drop by 11 scores the following year. Now, obviously, Aaron Rodgers isn't being drafted as high as he finished last season. But let's just give his 2020 season a little bit of context. Had Aaron Rodgers had the same number of pass attempts, but his career average touchdown rate instead of the touchdown rate that he had last year, he would have finished with 33 to 34 passing touchdowns. That's 14 fewer passing touchdowns, or 56 fewer fantasy points. That would have taken him from the QB4 in points per game to the QB11. He doesn't have the same type of rushing floor as other quarterbacks being drafted in the top 10. So I don't think he has a high enough ceiling to justify this cost, at least over on ESPN. And I guarantee you in a lot of your home leagues, Aaron Rodgers is going to be overdrafted. Probably one of the more surprising players on today's list is Derrick Henry. When you hear me talk about avoiding Derrick Henry, you probably think I'm an idiot. But let me be very clear here. I have Derrick Henry as the RB5 in my rankings, but he gets drafted as the RB3. That might not seem like a big difference, but it is in the early parts of your draft. That's why I want to talk about him on today's show. The bottom line is if Derrick Henry was a late first round pick, I would be in on him. We're just more than likely drafting him at his ceiling right now. As you guys know, last year, Derrick Henry rushed for more than 2,000 yards on the ground and he scored 17 touchdowns. He became just the 8th running back in NFL history to hit that 2,000-yard mark. And he was just the second player since the merger to have 2,000 rushing yards and 15 or more scores. And yet, despite all of this, despite the fact that he absolutely destroyed souls on the football field, Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook averaged more PPR points per game than Derrick Henry did. Significantly more. Kamara was at 25.2 points per game. Dalvin Cook was at 24.1 points per game. Derrick Henry was at 20.8. Now, there's nothing wrong with 21 PPR points per game. But how can we be so confident that a player who literally just made football history, how can we be so confident that he's going to do it again? And maybe the answer to that question is we're not expecting him to repeat that performance. So my comeback to you is, why are you drafting him third overall? If we assume that 20.8 PPR points per game is Derrick Henry's ceiling, then we're admitting that he doesn't have top running back in fantasy football overall in his range of outcomes. Over the last 3 seasons, a points per game average of 20.8 would have placed Henry third, and ninth in running back scoring. Again, in a year where Derrick Henry broke the game of football, he didn't come close to breaking the game of fantasy football. And if we're going to believe that his average points per game can increase, where is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? What statistical category is Derrick Henry going to get better in? He's probably not going to rush for 2,000 yards again, even with an extra game. And we now have a 5-year sample size of Derrick Henry not being a primary pass catcher out of his backfield. His highest single season target share is 6.7%. That came last year. Now, are we expecting more touchdowns? If anything, we should expect fewer. Tennessee scored 59 touchdowns last year. And like I just mentioned, touchdowns regress year over year. And not only that, but with a new offensive coordinator, a somewhat suspect defense, another stud wide receiver on that team, the Titans could rely more on the pass in 2021, and that would lead to a pass-to-rush touchdown ratio that favors Ryan Tannehill more than Derrick Henry. It's not that Derrick Henry can't be an RB1 in fantasy football. It's that if you've got the 3rd overall pick in your draft this year, you're drafting a player who you know has a very small chance to be the best player at his position. And to me, that's not a very smart investment. So like Derrick Henry, J.K. Dobbins is great. He's efficient. He's an awesome running back. But we have a situation here where we don't know what his usage is going to look like through the air. And let's start with the obvious reason why. The Baltimore Ravens offense. Say what you want about their offseason moves of adding Sammy Watkins and drafting Rashad Bateman. They're still a team that's led by Lamar Jackson and offensive coordinator Greg Roman. We can sit here and say they're going to throw the ball more, but even if they throw the ball more, they're still going to be a run-heavy team. Over the last 2 years, they've ranked 32nd in the league in pass rate. They had a 42.5% pass rate in 2019 and a 42.2% one last year. Even if you add 5 percentage points to those numbers, they'd still rank 32nd and 31st. Even if you add 10% to those numbers, they rank 26th and 28th. Even if they're more pass-heavy, they're still very run-heavy. And then that's sort of compounded when you look at how they've used their running backs out of the backfield. In 2019, Baltimore running backs had a 15.1% target share. Last year it was 15.8%. Those numbers ranked 29th and 25th in the league. Those target shares aren't very good. And those target shares are on top of a team that doesn't throw the ball a lot. In turn, Ravens running back targets aren't very high. In 2019, they ranked 30th in running back targets. In 2020, they were 31st. So I've now talked about this with Derrick Henry, and now I'm talking about it with J.K. Dobbins. Why do we care? Why do we care so much about how much volume a running back sees through the air? Well, we want top 10 seasons from our running backs, right? We don't want to draft a running back in the 3rd round for him to just meet expectation. We want a top 10 running back. We want a league-winning running back. Over the last 10 years, we've had 100 different top 10 running back seasons. 10 years, 10 running backs per season. That's 100. Of those 100 players, 23 of them had 50 or fewer targets during that top 10 season. 11 of them had 40 or fewer targets. The players who are finishing as top 10 running backs without passing game involvement, they're typically getting it done in the touchdown column. Of those 23 running backs with 50 or fewer targets who finished in the top 10, the average total touchdowns scored of those players, among those players, was 11.9 per season. The remaining 77 running backs in our sample of 100 running backs, they averaged 11.7 per season. And those remaining 77, they scored more fantasy points on average. They just weren't as reliant on touchdowns. And this makes sense intuitively. If a running back's not catching a lot of passes out of the backfield, and they're not adding points via receptions and receiving yards, then they're likely going to do it on the ground through touchdowns. And I will say, Dobbins should be able to find the end zone a good bit this year. The issue I have, aside from just banking on touchdown production, which I generally don't like doing, is that we just don't know what his genuine ceiling is in the touchdown column. The Ravens started making Mark Ingram inactive week 8 last year. He then played sporadically through the end of the season. But from week 8 through week 17, running back Gus Edwards, in games played with J.K. Dobbins, he had the same number of goal line rushes. And Lamar Jackson was just 4 rushes behind the two of them. So there's sort of this compounding concern with J.K. Dobbins. You're probably not going to get a whole lot of targets for him this year. That means he's going to have to make that up with touchdowns. But what if they divvy up goal line looks like they did last year? I do think overall that Dobbins is a player who's likely going to meet expectation. I just worry about the ceiling. That's it. Of all the players on today's list, I can understand drafting Dobbins most. I will say that. I just like some of the other running backs more that are going around him because of their upside. Let's talk about Josh Jacobs. If you've been doing best ball drafts this offseason, especially of late, you've probably gotten some deals on Jacobs. He's honestly dropped a little bit too far. Yes, I understand he hasn't been involved that much as a pass catcher. And yes, the Raiders just signed Kenyon Drake. But Jacobs has averaged the 3rd most rushing attempts per game since entering the league in 2019. He trails only Derrick Henry and Dalvin Cook. The thing is, if you're drafting him on a best ball platform versus drafting him somewhere like ESPN, there's a pretty big difference in ADP. According to ESPN's average draft position data, Jacobs is the RB19. He's being selected right next to Chris Carson and right above J.K. Dobbins. But what's more important about that ADP, he's being drafted ahead of wide receivers like Robert Woods, Julio Jones, Tyler Lockett, and Amari Cooper. Give me all of those wide receivers over Josh Jacobs, and give me J.K. Dobbins over him too. Now, like I just said, Jacobs hasn't been used that much as a receiver so far in the NFL. During his first and only 2 seasons in the league, he's seen target shares of 8.6% and 5.7%. Neither of those marks prorated close to a double-digit percentage share across a full season because he has missed some time. To put that more clearly, he's consistently ranking outside the top 20 at the running back position in target share. And the Raiders added Kenyon Drake. Not only could Drake dig into Jacobs' early down role, but he could see a lot of pass catching work too. And why should we believe that he won't see pass catching work? The Raiders haven't utilized Josh Jacobs that way. And what's even scarier about Jacobs' overall situation is what he could face in 2021. I just talked about J.K. Dobbins. He has efficiency on his side. And he's also playing on a team that's projected to be pretty good. They should see a lot of positive game scripts. The Raiders are a different story. FanDuel Sportsbook win total for the Raiders right now is 6.5. Now there's some juice involved with that number, but it's still low regardless. The Raiders aren't projected to be very good. And that's not surprising because if you look at strength of schedule from the perspective of projected team win totals, the Raiders have the toughest schedule in the league. That means not as many positive game scripts for their running backs, Josh Jacobs in particular. And that type of environment has been bad for Jacobs historically. Over the last 2 seasons, Jacobs has scored just 22.4% of his fantasy points when the Raiders were trailing by 6 or more points. Now, during this time frame, we've seen 76 running backs total 100 or more rush attempts. Of those 76, Jacobs' wild trailing rate ranks 22nd lowest. And of the 24 running backs with 300 or more carries, so the guys who are seeing a lot of volume, the really good running backs across the league, he's 5th from the bottom. This wouldn't be that big of a deal if Vegas was supposed to be good. Aaron Jones, for example, has seen the majority of his fantasy points come with a lead. But that's because the Packers have led a whole lot in games over the last 2 seasons. And we should expect the Packers to be pretty good this year too. Without those positive game scripts and without a target share backbone, it could be tough for Josh Jacobs in fantasy football this year. Now, a lot of people are drafting Mike Davis this year because of a lack of competition. It's not so much about Davis himself. If you like Mike Davis as a player, go for it. Get him. But if you're worried like I am, don't. This is how we fall into traps. We draft players who have good situations or perceived good situations, and we're ignoring the talent of the player or the situation of the player himself. I just would rather not willingly invest in a 28-year-old journeyman running back who has 0 seasons under his belt as a true bell cow in the NFL. He's never seen more than 165 carries in a season. And history is not on his side. Over the last 20 years, we've had 29 instances where a running back hit 200 or more PPR points in a single season at age 28 or older. Of those 29, 22 of them came from running backs who were once selected in the first 3 rounds of the NFL draft. The reason I'm pointing that out is because those running backs are in the league for a long time, probably because they're good. They were highly sought after running backs coming out of college. They had high draft capital. Of the 7 running backs who weren't earlier round picks, all but 2 of them, Michael Turner in 2010 and Arian Foster in 2014, caught at least 45 passes during their season of 200 plus points. 4 of those 7 seasons had 60 or more receptions. These guys were pass catching specialists. Now, Davis has shown decent pass catching ability throughout his career. He had 59 receptions last year. But it's not something that we can confidently project for 2021. Number Fire's projections, for instance, have him at 36 catches. It's just one of those situations where Davis looks fine on paper going into a season. Projections are going to love Mike Davis. My projections like Mike Davis. But I'm just not a fan of drafting because of lack of competition. I want to draft players who I think are actually very, very good. And while I think that teams can get away with average running backs and still be fine offensively, for fantasy purposes, those running backs are still a little bit fragile. Let's move to wide receiver and let's talk about Mike Evans. Look, Evans has been consistently amazing for both fantasy football and in real football. He's a monster. But he's also coming off a season where he finished with his lowest targets per game, target share, and receiving yards total of his entire career. And I get it, he was banged up a little bit last year. I'm sure that played a role in why he had a career low 18% target share. But here's the thing, guys. It wasn't just a career low. It was by far a career low. His previous season low in target share came in 2019 when he played 13 games. He saw a 19.6% target share that year. If you prorate that across 16 games, we're still north of 24%. Last season was actually the first time that Evans saw a prorated target share below 22%. And it was more than 4 percentage points lower than that. Was that all the injury? I'm sure the injury played some role there, don't get me wrong. But we can't ignore 2 pieces that were added to the Bucs offense. A new quarterback in Tom Brady and Antonio Brown. Now, Evans actually had a higher target share per game with Antonio Brown last year than without him. I just wouldn't put a ton of stock into that split because Evans wasn't banged up during the second half of the season compared to the first. That's what the injury report shows. And Chris Godwin was also dealing with an injury of his own in that split. And not only that, Antonio Brown is now getting actual reps in the Buccaneers offense. You know, I say it all the time in this show, but typically elite wide receivers will see a high target share no matter what. Because they're good. Targets are earned. And that's still the case for Mike Evans. He's not going to drop to like a 15% target share. What I'm concerned about is the ceiling. When there's genuine competition, I think we'd all agree that there's genuine competition in Tampa Bay. It's harder for a good wide receiver, an elite wide receiver, to have difference-making target shares. And there's also the elephant in the room here, and that's touchdowns. Evans scored 13 times last season. That was a career high. And this happened while having fairly similar red zone, goal line, and end zone target numbers compared to previous seasons. I understand that Tom Brady's efficiency helped, but so did a lot of luck. He converted 5 of 8 goal line targets into touchdowns. Since 2011, we've only had 8 wide receiver seasons with that many goal line scores. Tom Brady himself finished last season with the 3rd highest touchdown rate of his career. There should be some regression there. And even if there's not, Evans is now working against more elite competition in that offense. Guys, Mike Evans scored 13 touchdowns last year, and he was the wide receiver 16 in points per game. He was so touchdown reliant. In fact, among the 240 top 24 wide receiver seasons that we've seen over the last 10 years, Evans' percentage of points that came from touchdowns ranked 5th highest. Over 31% of his fantasy points came from touchdowns in 2020. With the competition in Tampa Bay, that's not something that I want to rely on. A lot of it has to do with the other wide receivers being drafted around him too. Now, I will say, if you end up getting Mike Evans, at least weeks 1 and 2 are good, because Tampa Bay gets Dallas and Atlanta, so he should be fine. So I did an episode earlier this offseason on how rookie quarterbacks impact their pass catchers in fantasy football. And look, I like Trevor Lawrence. I think Trevor Lawrence is going to have a Pro Bowl, all-pro career. But we have to be cognizant of what we've seen historically from rookie quarterbacks and how they've affected their pass catchers. Since 2011, we've had 29 quarterbacks attempt 300 or more passes during their rookie seasons. Of those 29 quarterbacks, we've seen 3 top 12 wide receiver 1 seasons. When looking at wide receiver 2 seasons or better, or top 24 seasons, we've had 9. And then if you look at top 36 seasons or wide receiver 3 seasons, we've had 17. Each of those numbers are below the league average rate. And like I talked about on that episode, what's even more interesting about that rookie quarterback data is the fact that quarterbacks usually don't support more than one fantasy relevant wide receiver or pass catcher on their team. Of the 3 wide receiver ones that caught passes from rookie quarterbacks since 2011, none of them played alongside a wide receiver who finished higher than wide receiver 40. None played with tight ends who ranked higher than tight end 12 too. And when you expand that to look at wide receiver 2s or better, not a whole lot changes. One of those wide receiver 2s did play with a tight end 9. That was during Baker Mayfield's rookie season. But none of them played with a wide receiver who was higher than wide receiver 40. I don't think this necessarily means that you just avoid pass catchers who have rookie quarterbacks. Like Darnell Mooney, for instance, is going fairly late. And he's going to go late in your casual home leagues. It's hard to argue against a late round pick. It just doesn't matter enough. But DJ Chark on Yahoo in particular, he's the wide receiver 34. On that platform, he's going ahead of Jerry Jeudy and Antonio Brown. I would take both of those wide receivers over DJ Chark. Now, it's true that team wide receiver 1s or wide receivers who have the highest ADP from their actual NFL teams, that they tend to outperform expectation in the middle rounds more than the alternative. I talked about that last month on the Breakout Wide Receivers episode. But the wide receiver situation in Jacksonville is not so clear-cut. On some platforms, Laviska Shenault is now going ahead of DJ Chark. And not only that, but we want those middle round wide receivers to be standalone. And there are other Jacksonville wide receivers that people are drafting. Now, everything that I've said so far has to do with historical trends rather than Chark himself. But Chark hasn't been the most reliable fantasy wideout either. He's had one good season in the NFL that happened 2 years ago. And that one good season came with 6 different performances where Chark failed to reach double-digit PPR points. So ask yourself, are we positive that DJ Chark is the best wide receiver on Jacksonville? If the answer to that is no, then why are we assuming that he's going to be the wide receiver from that team with a rookie quarterback who ends up working out? The last player on today's list, on today's show, is finally a tight end. It's Dallas Goedert. I think Dallas Goedert's a good tight end. Again, just to reiterate, I think all the players on today's list are pretty good. I just don't think that things aligned for Goedert very well this year, at least compared to how the fantasy football market is viewing him. Now, previous season fantasy totals, they're not everything. But I don't think Goedert was nearly as good as people think last season. Only 8 tight ends finished ahead of him in points per game. That's great. But that's not saying a whole lot because the tight end position is such a dumpster fire. And Goedert accumulated a lot of his points during some monster weeks. Even though he was a top 10 tight end in points per game, he finished with only 3 top 12 performances. His rate of finishing with a top 12 game was 23rd best among tight ends. And Zach Ertz, being an Eagle still, is a pain in the butt. Ertz missed 5 games last year, and Dallas Goedert was active for 4 of them. Goedert had 2 of his top 12 performances without Zach Ertz. And from a competition standpoint, things have only gotten worse. The Eagles now have Devontae Smith, and Devontae Smith is being drafted ahead of Goedert. That may not seem like a big deal, but as I alluded to in the tight end breakout show, it is a big deal. Goedert's currently a middle round pick who gets drafted just inside the top 100. Now that might change as we get closer to the season and we learn more about Zach Ertz. But as of this moment, Goedert's a middle round pick. We see lots of middle round tight ends every year. We average 6.3 middle round tight ends per season. And by middle round, I'm talking about rounds 6 through 9, picks 61 through 108. Of the 63 middle round tight ends that we've seen over the last decade, 8 of them were selected as a top pass catcher from their NFL team. Goedert is not that because Devontae Smith is being drafted ahead of him. But of those 8 tight ends who were the top pass catchers on their team, they exceeded ADP expectation by more than 30 fantasy points. The other 55 middle round tight ends, they underachieved ADP expectation on average. We see way more breakout tight ends come from tight ends who were the top pass catchers drafted from their team. And then on top of this, Goedert's working with a mobile quarterback who wasn't that great through the air last year. Like if Jalen Hurts is the starter all year, he's going to be fine in fantasy football. I like Jalen Hurts from a fantasy perspective. But from a real football perspective, there are question marks. Last year, he ranked 34th of 39 qualified quarterbacks in passer rating from a clean pocket. That's according to Pro Football Focus. So Goedert's working against a lot. If something happens to Zach Ertz and he's gone, things look a lot better. But I feel like Dallas Goedert is being priced right now as if Zach Ertz isn't even on the team. So that's the list. Again, I'm not avoiding these players no matter what. I just know how drafts generally go. And I know that I prefer a couple of guys more who go around these players than those guys. Hopefully this all helps you as you draft. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week.